Hi everyone, I have a lot of things I've been wanting to share that I wanted to continue talking about the Millennial Temple, but I just wanted to point out first, I know there's been a lot of talk about this Google Doodle that came out yesterday, and the first thing I thought of as soon as I saw that Google Doodle was Gog. That's what I always think about when I see them use the middle of or something. And I hadn't noticed the snake that's formed in the middle of his face as the shadow passes over Omar Sharif's face. But I did think of the word Gog and El. I think about that every time they do something like this. And then it's also been pointed out that the number 86 in the Strongs is the word Hades. And that this also looks like a spear tip, which I believe represents the mark of the beast. So it does appear that this is just another sign that the Gog Magog War is about to begin. And so what I wanted to say is that before the Gog Magog War can begin, there's something else that comes first. Before Ezekiel 38 and 39, there's Ezekiel 37, and in particular there's verses 17 and 18 which need to be fulfilled, and that's the joining together of the two sticks, which I've talked about before, which I believe represents the Jews and the Gentiles, the two witnesses, and it also represents the restored temple, which I've shown before, this table over here, which I believe also represents Yeshua and the bride. But I've shown this table before where I put in two candlesticks, Enoch, Elias, which is the name Elijah in the New Testament, and then bride and Yesh. And it comes up exactly where it talks about the two witnesses in Revelation 11. This is where it talks about the two witnesses, the two candlesticks, and the two olive trees. And the two candlesticks comes up over here, forming a base of a triangle that's formed with the names Enoch and Elias, and up at the top it says the temple of God, and then right at the base it says the two candlesticks standing before the Lord, and joining together with that you have the word bride coming down at an angle with the letters B-R-I-D-E, and Yesh coming through that as well. So I believe Enoch and Elias represent the two witnesses based on this table and the two olive trees. Okay, if you put it in this way with just the two candlesticks, Enoch, Elias, bride, and Yesh, you see that the two names come up in opposite directions from each other instead of forming the triangle as they did before. This time they're pointing in opposite directions, and I've talked about before how this is like when the Mount of Olives splits, as Natan had stated in his vision, and he saw two people coming out of their graves, one from one side of the mountain and the other from the other side of the mountain. But when you do it this way, you see that it has the two olive trees right in the middle between the two names, and my two witnesses comes up right in the middle. So to me, I believe this is about as perfect as you can get a representation of the restored temple in the matrix to come up in a matrix, because it's coming up exactly where it says the temple of God at the top, the two candlesticks right between the two names forming a triangle, which I believe the temple of God is a triangle with Jesus as the cornerstone. He's a cornerstone and he's the foundation, and you see Yesh over here at the foundation as well with the letters Y-E-S-H, and as I said, you also have bride coming down being joined with the 2 candlesticks standing as well. And so I believe this all represents the restored temple. You also have the holy city coming through here as well, which is New Jerusalem. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make is that this has to be fulfilled first if the book of Ezekiel is chronological, or at least from this point on, from chapter 37 through chapter 48. Actually, it starts talking about the temple in chapter 40 through 48, and that's what I want to continue talking about, is the millennial temple. But just before the Gog Magog War, you have Ezekiel 37, which, as I said before, could be interpreted as 3 sevens, as in the year 777, and you have the 2 sticks being joined together, representing the restoration, the restored temple, in verses 17 and 18. And then it talks about the Gog Magog War in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and then it starts talking about the millennial temple in chapter 40. Incidentally, when you go to Ezekiel 37, you see that it ends with the verse 27 and 28, and of course the 2 most important verses are 17 and 18, because this is the joining together of the 2 sticks representing the restoration, but I believe it's also represented by the numbers 27 and 28, which I believe also represent the years 2017 and 2018. And this is where it says, "My tabernacle also shall be with them, yea, I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and the heathen shall know that I, the Lord, do sanctify Israel, when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore." And so this is the restoration in verses 27 and 28. Okay, and then it talks about the Gog Magog War in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and then starting from Ezekiel 40, it begins to talk about the millennial temple. And just starting from verse 3, it says, "And he brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand, and a measuring reed, and he stood at the gate." And so you have the measuring of the temple here, just as you do in Revelation 11. And as I mentioned before, I believe the flax and the reed represent DNA. And I believe that was confirmed with a table that I did on the word helix. It had 4 matches. And in the second match, as you can see, the word helix is crossing through the word flax and crossing through where it says a bruised reed. So I believe that confirms that those 2 things represent DNA. And I had done a video about that some time ago. It was called Colors, Dyes, and Microscopic Things. Okay, so you have the measuring of the millennial temple over here. And if you skip to chapter 44, I believe that's the next really important chapter, because again, this is a number having to do with DNA, because there's 44 autosomes in the human body. But as you can see from this chapter, it says that the eastern gate will be shut, and it shall not be open, and no man shall enter in by it, because the Lord, the God of Israel, hath entered in by it, therefore it shall be shut. It is for the prince. The prince, he shall sit in it to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by the way of the porch of that gate, and shall go out by the way of the same. And so it's saying that the gate is going to remain shut, that it's for the prince to enter in by the way of the porch. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that. Another verse that's really important in here is verse 17, which I want to talk about later. But if you skip over to 46, you see that this is when the gate is opened. It says, "Thus saith the Lord God, the gate of the inner court that looketh toward the east shall be shut 6 working days, but on the Sabbath it shall be opened, and in the day of the new moon it shall be opened." And I believe the 6 working days represent the 6,000 years. And then this is when the prince enters in by the way of the porch. And like I said, I want to talk a little bit about the word porch. And so I believe this represents the consummation of the covenant. But if you go further down to verse 17, it mentions the year of liberty. And I've pointed out before that the year of liberty seems to come up in verse 17. Okay, if you put in the word Jubilee, you see that it comes up mainly in Leviticus 25, but I've mentioned before that if you add the 2 and the 5 together, that makes 7. And then the next time you see it mentioned is in Leviticus 27, verse 17, where it's talking about the year of Jubilee. And it seems to be giving the year, because it says, if he sanctify his field from the year of Jubilee, according to thy estimation, it shall stand. And then it talks about the year of Jubilee again in verse 18 and 21 and 23 and 24. And then it talks about the Jubilee again in 36. But the two main chapters are Leviticus 27, starting from verse 17, which I believe represents the year 2017, and then Leviticus 25, which the 2 and the 5 add up to 7. Okay, and if you put in the words proclaim liberty, you see it comes up one time in Leviticus 25:10, and then it comes up again in Isaiah 61, which if you add the 6 and the 1 together, that makes 7, and it comes up in Jeremiah 34, verse 8, and again, if you add the 3 and the 4 together, that makes 7, and it's coming up in verse 8, and then it comes up again in Jeremiah 34, verse 17. So I believe it seems to be indicating the year 17 or 18, or year 8 for the Jubilee, and Isaiah 61 is a parallel to Luke 4, and I've pointed out before that it mentions the year of Jubilee starting from verse 18 and going through to verse 19, where it talks about the acceptable year of the Lord, starting from verse 17 through verse 19, but it begins with verse 17. Okay, so it seems to be, once again, giving the year of liberty here in verse 17, going through 18. And like I said, I believe it's describing the consummation of the covenant in chapters 46 and 47. So these are two chapters that I want to talk a lot more about. But then it ends with chapter 48. That's the very last chapter, where it talks about the millennial temple. And in this chapter, it's talking about the 12 tribes, which I believe represents the 144,000. And that's the very last chapter, and it ends with verse 35, and it says, and it was round about 18,000 measures, and the name of the city from that day shall be the Lord is there. So it's in verse 48, so you have the number 8 once again, and it's talking about 18,000 measures at the very end. And like I said, this is the very last chapter, but it's interesting that it gives all these measurements, and then the total measurement at the end, the perimeter of the temple, is 18,000 measures, which I believe could once again be a clue for the year that the Lord will be there. Because it says, from that day shall the Lord be there, and that would be Jehovah Shammah. So I have a lot more to talk about concerning the millennial temple, but I just wanted to do this quick overview of how I believe all these things are pointing to the years 2017, 2018, which apparently we're still in the year 2017 according to God's calendar, but I believe it's just about to change to 2018 anytime now, and I believe that will be when the Gog Magog War begins, because that's also where it comes up in Revelation 20 verse 8, which, as I've mentioned before, that looks like 2018. So I believe it begins in 2018, and then after 1,000 years it goes full circle again to 2018. Okay, so things are definitely heating up with what's going on with Syria and Damascus, so this could be any day now, but like I said, I'm going to try to share more in the next video, but I just want to go over this timeline first. Thanks for watching, and God bless.